Hey, everybody. I am going to take us through some notes on Mesopotamia. This is going to be part one of the notes. It's pretty lengthy. If we were in a normal school year, you'd be writing these notes down fill in the blank style. But the way that this works is as I explain it, questions will pop up and you'll answer them. So let's start with some background information. Mesopotamia, this land that I've been talking about for a couple classes now, is the earliest known civilization. And by now, we know what a civilization is. It was developed along two rivers that are called the twin rivers, the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. And these start in the mountains of the country of what is today Turkey. So let me just back things up a little and talk about where this is. So, this part of the world is what's known as the Middle East. Okay? This is the Middle East part of the world. And the reason why it's called the Middle East is this is the Eastern Hemisphere, and the Middle East is kind of in the middle. It's where Africa, Asia, and Europe all meet. However, trivia question, if asked, is the Middle East part of a continent? It depends what country. Most of these countries are part of the continent of Asia. Egypt is considered a Middle East country, but Egypt's in Africa. Turkey is mostly in Asia, but there's the little tiny piece that's in Europe. So, most of the Middle East is in Asia with two exceptions, the little bit of Turkey that is in Europe, and then obviously the country of Egypt that's in Africa. So, civilization begins here in the modern day country that is Iraq. So I'm going to zoom in a bit so we get a sense of the lay of the land. So, this is where it all starts, right over there. Okay, so I said there was those two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates River, that come from the country that is today Turkey. So here's like a more focused in version of this area. So here is the Tigris River. So this is what is today's Turkey, and it flows down here. Here's the Euphrates River, flows down here. So those are called the twin rivers. Now, let me go back to my map here. If I was to zoom in some more, we'd probably eventually start to see the Tigris and Euphrates, although this looks to be let's see if this gives it to us, a different kind of map. We want like a terrain map. Let's see if I did this right. Yeah. So, I'm not seeing rivers. I see country borders. That's what those lines are. So this map doesn't have rivers, but the other map that I showed you did. All right, so it has lakes and stuff, but it doesn't have the big rivers that you saw. Where is it? Over here. So the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. Okay, the twin rivers, as they're called, flow more than 1,000 miles across the Middle East. The Tigris flows around the northeast side of Mesopotamia, while the Euphrates flows around the southwest. And actually, if I zoom out, I can show you this way. All right, so the rivers start up here. So the Tigris flows on the northeast side, and the Euphrates flows this way, as we can see on this map right over there. There's the twin rivers, over 1,000 miles of water. Okay, going back to our notes. The waters empty into the Persian Gulf, which we saw right there. And if I show you on the modern day map, this is the Persian Gulf, named for what is today the country of Iran. Back in ancient times was called Persia. And when we learn about the ancient Persians, we'll learn a lot about that name. Okay, today As you saw, the land between these two rivers is part of the modern day country of Iraq. And that word Mesopotamia, you might have been like, that sounds weird. What is that? And everything. Well, it's an ancient word that translates to mean land between the rivers, because this land that I'm putting the mouse in right here is what's known as Mesopotamia. And we'll talk about this green shaded thing called the Fertile Crescent a little later on. Now, in around 4000 BCE, so remembering the video from last time, if this is the year 2020, so it takes 2020 years to get to year zero, and then 4,000 years before year zero. So if we're talking about 4000 BCE, that's a grand total of over 6,000 years ago. People are nomads. That's that fancy social studies word for people that move around in search of food. Well, you'll remember from that civilization video I made with all the weird dots and different colors and things like that. The way it works is this. When the nomads hit Mesopotamia, they don't have to move anymore because this land has everything they need. It is rich and fertile, which means they're not going to have to move around for different things. They got food, they got shelter, they got clean drinking water, all that stuff. They can get a lot of fish and waterfowl. And when I say waterfowl, those are birds, things that are in the water that you can hunt. So things like duck, geese, quail, that kind of stuff. So once the nomads get here, they're like, we're good. This is our home. So they start settling in. And the area that has the most fertile soil between the rivers is the closest to where the two rivers meet. So that's in the southern part of Mesopotamia in an area called Sumer, which you see right here. So here's the Tigris, here's the Euphrates, right where they empty into the Persian Gulf. This is the most fertile soil, the most land that you can farm in, and it's called Sumer. So when we say Mesopotamians, we're talking in general about this whole region. When we say Sumer or Sumerians, we're focused on the people of southern Mesopotamia. But in early Mesopotamia, they're kind of synonyms because the Sumerians are the first people to start out in Mesopotamia. All right, so people settle in Sumer about 3,500 BCE, which, if we do the math, is over 5,500 years ago from today. Now, Sumer is the best place to live in Mesopotamia because it has the most fertile soil. And the people there learn how to control the environment to benefit themselves. Here's what I mean by that. Every spring, the rivers would flood. And the reason why that happens is the source of the Tigris and Euphrates River is up here in the mountains of Turkey, what is today Turkey. And the snow-capped mountains in the springtime would melt, therefore sending more water into the rivers, which caused the Mesopotamian lands to flood. Now, when we hear the word flood, it's usually based on some sort of natural disaster. However, this is how the Mesopotamians are going to control their environment to help water their crops. So, after the flood, what the Sumerians did is they built up these big raised areas of soil called levees, almost like these big kind of hills of soil. And they did it after the flood because the soil is wet and easy to maneuver. So the levees would then dry, so there would be these big hills of soil that protect your homes and protect your crops for when the river flooded. Because you don't want, obviously, we know you don't want rivers to flood homes. You also don't want them to flood crops because, as you can imagine, if you give crops too much water, that's going to kill it as well. Well, during the summer, I don't know why I have these two together, but here we go. During the summer, the land becomes dry. So these Mesopotamians have to deal with dry land. So what the Sumerians did is they poked holes into the levees to create channels or a tunnel for the water to get through the levees. And then these channels emptied into canals, which the Sumerians strategically designed to bring water directly to their crops. Now, in terms of what kind of crops that Mesopotamians used, their number one crop was barley. They also grew wheat, sesame, flax, which is a type of seed, all different kind of fruit trees, dates, and vegetables. Now, this system of watering your crops with levees, canals, and channels is called an irrigation system. And it takes a lot of planning and a lot of working together for it to work, because you don't want a system where you release too much water or not enough. So groups of people working together have to be organized, and that's how the idea of someone being in charge comes to be. So a government starts getting established to create laws, and the first laws were based on watering crops, which is irrigation. Basically, everyone came to an agreement. Now, I know what I just explained about irrigation can be tricky to understand. So I'm going to watch you a little clip. This is a little meta because you're watching a video and you're going to watch a video within a video, which is kind of weird. But here we go. Video within a video. Here we go.
The Tigris and the Euphrates are rivers that surround Mesopotamia. The problem with being surrounded by rivers is that when there is a lot of rain, the rivers flood. In ancient Mesopotamia, people figured out that if they could control the river, they could water their crops, and they wouldn't have to worry about being flooded out of their homes every few years. They could also get water to their fields when there wasn't enough rain, so that their crops wouldn't die. First, the Mesopotamians dug wide canals that allowed water to flow from the river out to their farms. Then they dug smaller irrigation ditches from the canals to their fields to water all of their crops. They put gates on the ditches so they could control how much water went from the canal to the fields. Modern irrigation gates are made out of metal, but probably the Mesopotamians made theirs from wood. Once the Mesopotamians were able to control the flow of water from the river to their farms, they were able to grow more crops and harvest a surplus each year.
All right, so the video just goes on to talk about some other things. So they used a word that you're going to hear me say from time to time, surplus. So surplus means extra. So when you're really successful, you don't just have enough to provide for everything you need. You have extra that you can trade for stuff that you don't have. And that's something the Mesopotamians do. All right, so hopefully we have a better understanding now of irrigation in Mesopotamia. Well, as the population gets bigger in Mesopotamia, Sumerians start to build cities. Now, there's not stone in Mesopotamia, and there's not a lot of trees because, in case you didn't know, this part of the world, lots of deserts. Now I know you're like, but wait, you were talking about the fertile soil. Yeah. But there's not a lot of trees in this area. So there's no stone, there's not a lot of trees. So they make their homes out of mud brick. Now, I know what you're thinking. Ew, gross, mud. Maybe some of you were like, ew, gross, bricks. I don't know. So if you have ever played in the mud, raise your hand. I can't see you through the screen, so I don't even know who's raising their hand. So if you ever played in the mud, you know that you can form stuff in the mud. And when you're done playing in the mud, let's say you make like a square, right, in the mud. And then the next day comes, the mud's dry. That square is going to be pretty hard. So that's what they did, is they took mud, and they had plenty of it from the river, formed it into a brick shape, and then it hardened. So then what they did is they mixed the mud from the river with crushed plants called reeds. In the video, you saw them. They looked kind of like meadows. And then they left the bricks out in the sun to kind of bake, and that creates the mud bricks. And one of the great mud brick cities in Sumer is this city called I know, it's a funny name, And is located right here in Sumer. Now, you might be thinking, but wait, if you live in a mud brick house, what happens when it rains? Good question. However, remember, it's a desert, so it doesn't rain too often. And when it did rain, they probably had a big cleanup to do. All right. So, the next thing we have is this idea of a city-state. I'll talk more about that in a second. So each Sumerian city is like its own country with its own government. So this is kind of hard for us to realize sometimes because we live in a country all together. But in this area of the world in ancient times, every city has its own leadership. Okay? They're not united. It's every city-state on its own. So it's like a separate country. And what a city-state is, it's a city and then the farmland around the city. And the reason why it includes the farmland around the city is cities do not have farms inside of their city walls. Because, yeah, in ancient times, there was walls around cities. It would just take up so much space. So the farmland was like outside of the city walls, but still part of the city-state. So let me just show you more of this stuff. So as I mentioned, for protection, cities have those walls of sun-dried brick. It's not just kind of like what you're thinking of, like criminals and stuff like that. It's also dangerous animals. In fact, Mesopotamia used to have a lion, not just one. There was a lion that lived naturally in Mesopotamia. It was called the Mesopotamian lion. And unfortunately, it became extinct back in the time that Rome ruled the world. Because if you know anything about Roman history, you know they had gladiatorial games and they would use animals in them. And unfortunately, that led to the extinction of the Mesopotamian lion. But at this point in history, there's lions, and you don't want them walking through your city. And the gates are made out of bronze. So the streets are really narrow and lead to the center of the city. The reason why they're narrow is, remember, ancient times, cars don't exist. So you don't have big, wide city streets. Near the center of the city, you have the houses of the upper class, your wealthier people. And those are priests and merchants. These houses had 2 floors and balconies that were made out of wood that overlooked a nice courtyard. Now, outside walls don't have windows, like walls that are near the outside, they don't have windows because the heat of the sun, because then if you're in a mud brick house, that like sun getting inside will make it really hot. And also, ancient times smelled. There's no garbage collection. There's no bathrooms. There's no deodorant. So it was smelly. And yeah, you don't want that coming into your house, that smell. So courtyards have nice fresh air inside of your house. Now, behind the houses of the wealthy, next we have the middle class. So those people were government officials, people that work for the government, shopkeepers, those are people that like work in stores, and then a position called an artisan. An artisan is a skilled worker, someone who knows how to make things. The middle class houses also had courtyards, but they're not 2-floor houses, they're 1 floor. And then further out from the center of the city, you had your lower class, which were your farmers, your unskilled workers. Those were basically your heavy lifters, like the people that like made the mud bricks and hauled them to different places, and fishermen. Those make up your lower class. Sometimes these Mesopotamian city-states had all-out war over where one city ended and another city began. All right. Now, the ancient people are very religious people.